Now, today we'll be talking about the continent of Dereth, which is the primary location in which we have all the adventures happening on Primus. I'd talk about the planet, but the knowledge of the world is much less than you'd think. There's the continent of Dereth, there's the hidden continent, which has been given a name since then, Aburian, which is kind of devoid of life. When I say devoid of life, I want you to picture landscape, terrain, just completely terraformed into cityscape, fully urbanized, and yet there are no people, and no animals, and no plants, and no bugs, and no bacteria. Nothing, not a single speck of life. And that's Aburian. Dereth, on the other hand, a lot more has been happening here. I actually have a map up, and I probably should have put it up here, but I'll just describe it in brief. There's the overall breadth of this area is the part we're concerned with. There are two land bridges that go off from this chunk and lead into an area called the Dyers. The Dyers are exactly what they sound like. We'll discuss those in a bit. And in the north, there's an area known only as Crater, which nobody's exactly sure why it's there, and all efforts to try and settle or colonize or otherwise explore in the area just kind of fail. Things are just kind of off up there. So, Dereth. I could spend forever talking about the geography of this place. Again, I'm not going to bore you with it. But if we were to look at it, up against the map here, let's just do this right here. Up over here is the Kingdom of Alluvia. Down south and west of that, in a narrow band, is the Nevere Confederacy. Just south of that, throughout the mountain chain and the rich area around here, is the Osteth Republic, and to the east and along the land, the peninsula over there, along with the chunks of land and the rich farmland area there, is the Show Empire. There's a large gap in between the Alluvian Kingdom and the Show Empire, which is known as the Dry Reach Zone. I'll talk about that later. North of Alluvia, up here, we have Central, which is where the Olthoi live. Of course, I'll talk about them. To the west of them is Crater. To the west of them is a massive, untamed area known as the Stonehold region, which I've already mentioned by now several times. And then, of course, you go south into the relatively unknown areas, which are still the frontier, which include the city-state of Collier. And then, of course, there's the massive inner sea that intertwines through here, and the Dyers farthest to the west. So that's a basic geography. The four islands, the four Lascelles, are all fairly close to Dereth, all things considered. Only a few hundred miles off of the coast in most cases. Now, all of Dereth really revolves around the concept of year zero, so I'm going to try and describe this as best as I can. Based on what happened of Vassail Lascelles, it's probably clear that whenever happened there happened to the rest of Dereth as well, because everyone just kind of woke up one day. Now, Dereth had it simultaneously worse and better than the denizens of Vassail Lascelles, because they didn't have one small contained community of near-perfect paradise. Dereth is very functional mundanely and follows the laws of physics, for example. So, after a time, there was an organization that had been around before Year Zero, that came together and organized a new calendar to denotate the fact that history had changed and they're not sure what had happened before the time. And they called that Year Zero. This happened on roughly Year 5. If I was to actually look at it from a fundamental perspective, the start date of Year Zero and the actual moment when the Scions were wiped out are actually pretty far off. It's about 3 or 4 months separate from each other, but they were literally guessing. Like I said, Year Zero and the calendar was not established until several years after the event happened. Now, the organization that did this is called the Order of Summoners, which is a pseudo-religious, actually it's probably more accurate to call it spiritual than religious, organization centered around green mages, which I'll discuss now, I suppose. The continent and the world, indeed, are governed by 8 elements: earth, wind, fire, water, light, darkness, life, and spatial. Okay? Now, these elements basically make up everything. This is true in the Imperium as a whole as well, if you're curious. And so a lot of life kind of revolves around these things. There are people who are born with the ability to become summoners. It's random. It's not genetic. It doesn't happen. You also can't train to be it. You're either born with it or you're not. So these people have the ability to manifest what are called aspects. These aspects are physical representations of some part of their personality manifested with elemental energy. So, for example, if you can imagine me sitting here, but I'm just, instead of having skin or hair or anything like that, there's just this glowing green energy. Still in the shape of me, or in the shape of a snake, or in the shape of a fox. They can take multiple shapes, although they're not shapeshifters. They have, what I mean by that is, any given person's aspect can manifest in different ways, but they cannot change that way thereafter. They're stuck in it. Okay, makes sense? And so they can interact through these aspects and have a greater understanding of the nature of the world as a result. So the Order of Summoners is all about dealing with that elemental energy, the elements in general, the summoners in general, and kind of has evolved into being this sort of, we're here to take care of people organization. They are peacekeepers, helpers, providers. They provide emergency support. They take care of, refugees or anything like that. That kind of a situation. So they're rather well liked the entire world over. As you might imagine, they do a lot of good for a lot of people. The Order, I suppose we'll discuss the Order a little bit more in brief. The Order is divided into 3 wings. The first wing is all about dealing with summoning and summoners and elementalism. The second wing is all about trying to take care of people. The relief efforts I mentioned earlier, caretaking, helping, giving, redistributing, all that fun stuff. Medical aid, financial aid, food, literal healing, that kind of a thing. And the third wing is the military wing, also the smallest by far. They deal with threats to the populace and people, usually on behalf of someone else. They're also the wing that tends to employ some of the higher advanced technologies and magic technologies that the organization has come to understand over the years. Excuse me. They all have their own titles and whatnot. I'm not going to bore you with all that. They all also kind of revere a individual who was apparently the one who founded the Order in ancient times. He was supposed to be a young child. Nobody knows his name anymore. They just call him the Pinnacle of Light. That's his title. And the Pinnacle of Light is the one individual that everyone, and the Pinnacle of Light will founded this great thing, and by his teachings and orders we take care of people and blah, 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 that kind of thing, right? Again, I don't want to stress this because it's not religious so much as it is, it's not even really spiritual, it's more emotional. The Order is in many ways the emotional core of the continent, and one of the things that has kept the continent sane over the years. For example, anybody who's been paying attention to this campaign knows that there has actually been no war in the entire history of the campaign, in the entire history of the world, up until the events of the campaign, which is basically happening now. So, after 350 years of no warfare, and most of that's because of the Order. Now, so that's how the calendar was established. Early on, a few other things were established too, some basic concepts, which are still present to this day. For example, the idea of clan names. Now, I've tried to emphasize this, and I feel like I've failed, because it's a hard thing to talk about. Basically, your clan name is more your name than your first name is. You don't have a surname. You don't have, I am John Bob or whatever. I am John of Bob. I am John of Clan Bob or whatever. Something like that, right? And that clan name is an integral part of who and what you are. And a whole culture has adapted based on these clan names and the significance of them, which I'll talk about in a moment. But let's talk about how the clan started. Remember, all these people basically woke up one day. No idea who or what or where or why. And because of the significant amount of interracial mingling, and mind you, there's a couple dozen races on Dereth, so of all these species just kind of constantly intermingling and interacting with each other, it was quickly determined that trying to have some kind of family surname thing was just silly, and so they started establishing clan names based on areas or ideas or concepts from, back then when they were still getting hold of things like how to control fire, for example. No, not magical fire, just fire. And so a lot of that's when all the clan names were established, and it was basically divvied up amongst the millions and millions and millions of people. We're talking, there's about roughly 1 billion people on Dereth as of now. Obviously, it wasn't that way back then, but the population has been rising ever since. So that's roughly the population of the continent, roughly 1 billion. It's a little over that if I was to go into it. So that all those clan names were distributed amongst them, and a lot of those clan names kind of quickly settled into racial lines. For example, all the dwarves have their clan names, all the elves have their clans, etc. Some of the races didn't see the need for clan names based on their unique circumstances. These include fairies, lycanthropes, although that's a special case, mites, and I think that's it. Olthoi technically don't have clan names. They, however, use their brood as a clan name in order to better integrate with the rest of society because of how important clan names are to society, which I will now discuss with you. Let's say I approach you and say, I am Arshan Gaia of Lorerunner. Okay, that's how that would go, right? And you say, hello of Lorerunner. Usually referring to someone as of clan name is the honorific. That's how you refer to most people in general. If you were to say, hello, Arshi and Gaia, 9 times out of 10, I would take that as an insult. Because you don't just refer to someone by their first name unless you actually are on a first name basis with that person. And this probably makes sense, actually, because it's kind of how, at least in the States here, most society works here. You don't just call someone, hey, Bob, in a casual tone, unless you have established some kind of relationship with that person, working, professional, friendship, whatever. So you would refer to me as, Arshin Gaia of Lorerunner, or just of Lorerunner. It's the different levels of politeness there, and there's some professional decorum as well. There's also a bit of a couple of niggles in this. For example, half-elves aren't really a species so much as a product of other species. Elves have the ability to mate with a lot of other species, and so there are half-elf, half-bandlings, half-elf, half-orcs, half-elf, half-dwarves, etc. Nobody knows this yet because elves have not been exposed to humans long enough, but it is possible for there to be half-elves and half-humans as well. And so half-elves usually adopt one of the clan names of one of their parents, whether their mother or their father. The choice they make is usually hugely significant, and some half-elves usually have a very hard time choosing it. They also don't have to choose one of their family clan names. They can choose another one if they want to. They usually do that when they come of age, which for most half-elves is about when they hit about 15, though that can vary based on the other race, obviously. So for example, in half-elves, it's kind of a weird thing. For example, if a half-elf approaches you and says, I am, half-elf of Anvilmar, you know immediately that he is following a dwarven clan name, which means he adheres to dwarven traditions and mentalities, whether or not his father or mother is dwarf or not. That's not the relevant part. Now, there are some cases where someone will take upon themselves a new clan name. This is actually very rare, to the point of almost being exceptionally rare, but for example, I'll give you a direct example. There's a group of bandits who operate on the eastern coast, up and down Alluvia and to the Show Empire, and they call themselves the Black Brine. They are a tight-knit group, effectively their own private family, and because of the significance of that, anyone who joins the Black Brine, after they feel like they have become a part of that family, usually abandon their clan name and start referring to themselves as, Arshi and Gaia of Black Brine, for example, right? So that's a thing that can happen, but is pretty damned rare. There are examples of people making an individual clan name for just themselves. That's exceptionally rare. One of the party members has done that. You know which one you are. So that's how clan names work in general. Now, there are two other things with clan names. Some people don't give out clan names. That is always significant. There is no way to misinterpret that is some kind of a message. It'd be like approaching someone and saying, hi, I really hate pizza or whatever. That's not the same equivalent. But I mean, it's a big message. If you come out and say, hi, I am Bob, and don't give a clan name, people are like, whoa. People will treat you completely differently as a result of that, right? The kind of message you want to send with that can vary significantly. Some people abandon their clan name. Some people disavow their clan name. Some people are simply hiding it. Some people have taken up a surname concept in defiance of tradition, that kind of a thing. And again, there is one party member who has done this. This is a funny thing, right? But to give you an NPC example, there's an ogre who just goes by the name of Bonebreaker, which, spoiler alert, is not only not his real name, but he does in fact have a clan name. I don't remember either off the top of my head. But he goes by Bonebreaker as a specific message that this is his new identity, his new title, his new moniker, the new self that is him, right? By similarity, one of the players I recently asked in character why it is he had abandoned his clan name, and his response was that he believed that traditions should not be followed, basically. I'm summarizing excessively. He had a nice big response about it, but old traditions followed for the sake of tradition are not going to accomplish anything. All they're going to do is stagnate society, and therefore he believed that change needs to be invoked. That's actually an extremely dangerous perspective to have, and probably would mark him as people would probably look at him as if he was insane if he said that to most people. He did not say that to most people. He said that to the most powerful man in the entire continent. So we'll see how that works out for him. But moving along. So that's how clan names work. Now, let's go ahead and fast forward a little bit to the Dereth Accords. Now, for the first 200 years of society, basically two organizations kind of ran things. The Order, which I already described, and the Dereth. Now, the Dereth are unusual because there are three types of Dereth. There are people who look odd. They have unusual pupils, and they have kind of this weird aura radiating about them, and they have unusually smooth skin, and they're really tall. Not like giant size. We're talking like 7 feet on average. And the Dereth, those are people known as pures. Then there's people known as revenants, who look like more or less normal, but their skin is rotting and drying away, and they're kind of desiccated. Sometimes they don't have eyes, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's the people even below that, who are the basic undead, for all intents and purposes, people whose bodies are literally rotting and shambling, still have the full capacity to talk and speak. And the Dereth have their own massive culture, which I will not discuss in full detail here, mostly because the players have never interacted with the Dereth yet. Not directly, anyways. But suffice it to say, the Dereth are the big boys. They have tremendously advanced technology and magic, and I suppose I can give this away now because it's been revealed by the point of the campaign. It has been revealed that the Dereth are what's left of the Scions. Every Dereth was at one point a Scion. It is not entirely certain why they are rotting undead or why they survived the cataclysm that killed all of the other Scions, so we're not exactly 100% sure how that happened or why. Now, the Dereth have all that power and all that knowledge. They also have a servitor race they call the lycanthropes. And you could probably guess why they call it that. There are quite a few types. Where tigers, where wolves, where rats, where crocodiles, where sharks, you name it, basically. The lycanthropes are interesting. They have their own little cultural tics, which I'll describe very briefly. A lycanthrope lives to serve their house. They are 100% loyal to their house. I'll describe the full details of what that means in a second. But most lycanthropes, try to adhere to very strict regimen. They keep themselves very disciplined, very self-contained, and most of them fail. The vast majority of lycanthropes fail at this task. The elite few who really rise to the occasion, to rise to be really great, and excellent servitors, are rewarded with service outside of the Dereth lands. These are the ones that are actually sent out into the rest of the continent to interact with the other races, the races that are not Dereth, right? So most people, when they encounter a lycanthrope, they are encountering effectively the elite upper crust of the ambassadors and the diplomats and all those kind of people of the lycanthrope people. So it's kind of tailored people's opinions on them. But that's the point. It's done on purpose. Most people also do not interact with Dereth directly. In fact, Waiju, the city which the Dereth live, which is the Dereth capital, almost never, if you go there to trade, and there is frequent trade on the inner sea with that area, the people who go there to trade basically never actually interact with any Dereth when they land at the docks. They interact with lycanthropes. The Dereth themselves almost never interact with people personally. That's what I'm trying to get across. So the Dereth had been basically running society, constantly moving in and saying, no. And just fixing situations, adhering to things, playing peacemaker in addition to referee is really the best way, but they didn't actually rule so much as constantly kept things under wraps. That, of course, led to everything just kind of constantly being just under a bubble of frustration until it reached a point where some of the Show Empire, which was the only organization around at this point in time, and the burgeoning states were willing to go to war. They were actually willing to go and fight each other. And the Dereth showed up and said, no, we're not going to allow you to do this. And they literally disarmed the armed forces of both sides and laid out what is now known as the Dereth Accords. Before I go into that, let me rewind just a little bit. The first nation that was established was the Show Empire. The second nation that's established is actually the Osteth Republic, which I'll talk about individually as well. And then then there was a few states of aligned cities that became known eventually as the Navarre Confederacy, But there was also a vast tract of area with very uncoordinated, very ill-concerned merchant lords who had no real organization past the fact that I rule my city and that's it. And these various wealthy people did control, it controlled powerful companies, powerful mercenary groups, that kind of a thing. But they weren't, it was just the city, right? It was effectively massive chunks of city-states. The Dereth Accord is when those states over here in the desert area, and well, it's not just desert, that's extreme exaggerating, but in the western area, all united into the Navaria Confederacy, and when all these city-states of all these wealthy magnates combined into what is now referred to as the Alluvian Kingdom. So this is when those two nations became into being, therefore calling forth the Four Nations. There's another incident in there, too, because there was a large group of people who felt they were misrepresented in the Four Nations, and these included a lot of the so-called uncivilized races, although they weren't referred to this at the time. For reasons not entirely understood by history, they disagreed with the Dereth Accords and refused to ratify them, and so they were basically told to get out. They were exiled en masse from the Four Nations. They headed northwest and formed basically settled into the land that is now known as Stonehold, and generally are referred to as Stoneholders, sometimes somewhat derogatorily. As a result of this refusal to ratify the Accords, that's why they have now been, and even to this day, are referred to as the uncivilized races. It has been mentioned, and it is known to the players and therefore to the viewers, that there is no Stonehold nation. There's just that whole area which has been settled by centaurs and goblins and kobolds and mosswarts and a few other random races. Did I mention gnolls? Because that's important. And those races are just up there kind of doing their own thing. Usually the only organization exists at like the city level. The biggest organization that actually exists is there is a city-state, the city-state of Stonehold itself, which is run by a particularly powerful goblin magnate, or at least was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So that led to their evacuation into the Stonehold region and the establishment of the Four Nations. Now, the Olthoi have been interacting with all of this for quite some time and have been doing their own things, basically to try and keep the peace. I'll talk about the Olthoi a little bit more when we do a racial thing, but suffice it to say they are very large, sentient bugs who hate violence and love to get along with others, and therefore, as I already mentioned, they will adopt a clan name just to get along more with other people, or they will try to, make peace with people. They actually enjoy things like trading or talking and socializing. Most Olthoi like to travel the world just to sample new foods and new people and to see new sights and smells and all that kind of thing. That kind of a race. The Olthoi haven't really been politically active, and indeed even aren't to this day, not counting the Spurka thing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. There are two other groups that are relevant to mention here. One is the fairies. Now, the fairies had their own city-state called Arwick, and they had basically just been living on their own, doing their own thing. When the Dereth Accords happened, the Derechosts, or rather, their lycanthropes, approached the fairies and said, "You are now the mediators in place of us. We are backing off. We have made these accords, and we're hoping these nations will be able to maintain their own business, and we're backing off so all you children will be able to start taking care of your own affairs. But you guys are being the mediators in our absence." So the fairies got together and formed their own little organization, whose name I actually don't remember off the top of my head because it's been so long since they've actually done anything in interacting with the campaign. That act as peacemakers and diplomats and neutral parties, for trade or for justice or for whatever happens to be needed at a national level. The other group is the Halflings. The Halflings had all kind of, over the course of several decades, this is way before the Dereth Accords, found this one area where it was just wonderful farmland and wonderfully arid land, and they all just kind of, as time spread, rumors started to spread, and they just kind of slowly migrated there until it got to the point where like 90% of all halflings and then 95% of all halflings all lived in this one region, which they call the Eastham region. Now, they like just being on their own. They don't like dealing with things like currency. They don't like dealing with things like politics or taxes. I mean, they have their own versions of these things, but it's all extremely minor and extremely low key. There is no actual leader of the halflings or of the Eastham people. During the Dereth Accords, one of the things that happened was the High Queen, Alyssa, turned to the halflings and said, "Why don't we go ahead and ratify a document between us. And it's really simple. We'll make sure everyone leaves you alone, including us. And you provide food and resources and grain and all those wonderful bounties of your farmland to us as just a thank you kind of a thing. And the halfling said, sure. So the whole Eastham area has just kind of been doing its thing ever since. The party has not really interacted with that since the war broke out, so we're not really sure what they think of that. But now, let's let's see, that would have been 100 years ago, so 30, 50, 30-ish years later, there was a Neveri mayor. And this mayor was just doing his business, just like he had for the last 40 plus years. And a fairy happened to come to town and spotted him and immediately ousted him as a desolate, because fairies can see that sort of thing as part of their natural sight. And so that kind of led him to being stoned to death in the middle of his own town by his own people, which you probably don't understand the significance of that, although you will by the time I finish discussing the politics of Neveri. That was a bit of a wake-up call, and nobody knew what to make of it, but that is the first recorded example of a desolate being found out on the continent. And the reports and sightings and whatnot of desolates have only been increasing over time. Most people think that's just a natural reaction to the fact that we have more knowledge of them, and therefore, we have better technology and better magic in order to identify desolates. Some people think the actual number of desolates is increasing. This is not the video where I'll be discussing desolation. That's next week. But I just wanted to mention that there because it is significant and is one of the huge driving forces of the campaign. Next point. Let's talk about the politics of the Four Nations really quick. The Show Empire is run by the Emperor, who is a Burun, of course. Now, I mentioned the Show Empire was the first of the nations. It was truly the first organization to come to be because the Buruns, who all lived in the same general vicinity, which was a huge wealth of farmland and whatnot, immediately said, yes, we are obviously the superior race and therefore we should be in charge. Now, I say this somewhat, like, ha, we are Nazis or whatever. No, nothing like that. These people, Buruns, are massive, very, very durable individuals who live extremely long lives. There are some Buruns still alive today who were around during year zero, for example. And so the Buruns have long life, they endure, and they tend to have that, wise philosophy kind of a thing going for them. So it just seemed kind of natural that they took command. Basically, they started taking control of the situation, and the other two races which are predominant in the region, the Sclavi and the Moorsmen. As they just kind of started taking over, it just kind of came natural. It's like, well, we should be the ones in charge. We're the ones who are taking charge. Therefore, we are the ones who should be in charge. And that's kind of been the attitude of the Burun ever since, and kind of describes one of the ways the Show Empire works in a nutshell. The Show Empire functions almost entirely on tradition. To name one example of this, you are given a tenure of military service. You have so many years to serve in the Show military. When your years are up, regardless of all other circumstances, you are expected to stand down. You don't actually have to. You are not fired, but you are expected to stand down because if you didn't, it would be an insult to the traditions of the Show people. That's the kind of thing the Show Empire does. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Now, the Emperor is theoretically in charge of the Show Empire, but ultimately he has no real power because all of his power has slowly been bled away into the Counts. The Counts are the ones who actually run the Show Empire. Each one, and this is why it's actually referred to as an empire. The Emperor basically runs things in his home city, and the other Counts are, theoretically at least, responsible to him, but they run their own affairs and they have their own little cultural tics for their regions and whatnot. But each of the Counts effectively runs their own region completely separate from the empire as a whole. Now, in times of emergency, the Emperor can declare, well, I need to be completely in charge, and the Council of Counts will be convened, and then they all have to obey his commands, but that's only been done a couple of times ever. The way that the cultural perspective of politics works in the Show Empire is perception determines reality. It's the way I like to say that. For example, let's say that I am a wealthy Burun magnate, and I am, I am nice and kind and wonderful to people, and I take care of people, and someone shows up and proves that I have secretly, been beating several of my servants in the past. And so because they have shamed me like that, I now have to act like that. Not only shamed, but like I am a horrible person, regardless of how I actually am. Most show, this applies to all three races equally, but especially the Burun, tend to act the way they are perceived at that particular point in time, which can change just like that. And so, for example, to use a real example that happened, if a Burun, has a rival and they have people steal something, some of their people steal something that is valuable from that rival, they can then go back in public and give it back to them, and now they are seen as this benevolent person, so they can act like that, and the other Burun is seen as being grateful and therefore has to act grateful to them, forcing a connection, a political connection between the two rivals, and forcing one of them to be subservient to the other. And that's kind of how that system works. They also have an unusual court system. Basically, if you remember Thane from Mass Effect 2, it's that taken to its furthest extreme. If you are a soldier or an assassin or whatever, and you were ordered to go do something incredibly terrible, you are completely free of blame. The person who sent you, however, is fully culpable. It's kind of a weird system. They also have a guilty until proven innocent perspective on things, and they have no problem with putting you away as hard labor. They use prisoners as labor force rather extensively, actually. Not slaves, because that's a different thing. Now, the show also rely tremendously on trade to keep their empire functioning. It's probably no surprise that a huge chunk of their empire is land that has a coast. They have tons and tons of naval trade and organization, and in fact the dry reach incident probably completely ruined about half of that and required massive restructuring of their naval fleet, but I'll get to that later because the dry reach incident is much more recent. So that's the show empire. The Osteth Republic is a little bit different. The lands of the Osteth are very dangerous. I feel like I haven't emphasized this enough. There are creatures out there that could kill level 5 adventurers in one-on-one without even trying. And that's just normal. That's the average stuff. The heavy stuff usually requires siege weaponry, vehicles, coordinated military strikes, and that kind of thing to bring down. It is an extremely dangerous area that happens to be ridiculously wealthy in resources and in arable farmland. So the Osteth region was was already settled, I should say, by the Lugians, who are a race of massive giants, and the Mites and the Gnomes are also the other major races of the Osteth Republic. Although that's just the primary races. There's a bit of a metropolitan thing for the other races, because basically everyone is welcome in the Republic. The only requirement is you have to pull your weight. That's how the Republic's politics work in a nutshell. They have a meritocracy. You have to earn your right through service to the public and service to the people in order to be pushed upstairs, so to speak. In general, that leads to a weird situation because there are very few layers of hierarchy, there we go, amongst the Osteth Republic. There's, people, and however many layers below the emperor, the mayor. So any given town, town mayor may have, a marshal or a few bureaucrats or secretaries or whatever. That's not on the list. That's what I'm talking about. But you've got your towns and then you've got your mayors, and that's basically it. Because the actual governing body of the Republic is consistent of every single mayor of every single town and city in the entire Republic. And so whenever an actual meeting is called to determine Republic policy, every single mayor ends up leaving their town and heading towards Linvecta Call in order to convene for this massive Senate meeting. If you picture the one in Episode 1, 2, or 3 of Star Wars, it's about that size. There's a lot of people there. And they have all sorts of weaving and technological devices to help them all interact with each other privately and openly. The other odd quirk of the Republic is they need 100% consensus in order to ratify something for the Republic as a whole. For the whole Republic to decide something, every single one of those mayors across every single town has to all agree 100%. No dissenters. And there have been a few cases where one person or 5 people or 10 people have said no, and they've just stayed in Senate in session until they have managed to hammer that out one way or the other. There's a lot of politics that goes on in that Senate floor that I won't bore you with right now, because you can probably imagine how most of that works just off the top of your head. Now, there is one individual who is the face of the council, of the Senate. That is the Titus. The Titus is basically the gentleman who is in charge of governing everything, as far as, the actual organization. He's the guy running the meeting, basically. He's an organizer. but he also has the job of being the face when it comes to any affairs of state. So anytime a Alluvian official or a Navarre official or a show official comes to meet with the Republic, it's the Titus that they're actually meeting with. And anytime the Republic wants to go elsewhere, he's the one who's sent. He basically has the job of ambassador and diplomat in addition to chairperson. It's not a fun job, and usually requires someone who has a very disciplined and strong mind in order to maintain that kind of a thing. So let's talk about Alluvia. Alluvia's politics have changed once, but the way it used to work is there's the aristocracy. Now, I put that in quote-unquotes because it's not an organization. It's not, they don't work with each other. It's just all the people who have the money. There's no real nobility of bloodlines, not really. It's more about, I mean, there are certain families that are wealthy and powerful, but it's the wealthy part that matters. Alluvia is run completely and 100% on money. So, the Alluvian, the wealthy people are the ones who have basically run Alluvia for some time, and they had this weird situation that was kind of counterbalancing that was put into place by the High Queen herself. See, the High Queen was the one actually ultimately in charge of the entire monarchy. It makes sense, right? And she's a Lord Elf, so she doesn't age. So she's actually been the one since year zero who has been in charge. She's been around for a long time. She created a system where there were basically you could buy your way into position in order to be one of the high chancellors kind of a thing. I forget the exact title I came up with, but that kind of a position. However, once you did so, you had to spend so much of your time and effort on defending your position that you were effectively removed from the political equation and therefore could not actually ruin anything. Furthermore, all the other people had to constantly be catering to favor. They couldn't tell the queen, we want this happen, because if they did, the queen would immediately go to their rivals and say, they want this to happen, and would gain their support and to push them off. And so the queen balanced the aristocracy against itself, constantly having them fighting each other in a passive sort of way. Like, if these people are like, oh, we kind of want this kind of thing to happen, she'd turn to these other people and say, well, they kind of want this thing. Oh, no, we can't have this. And so the aristocracy would literally be constantly bribing and trying to push their particular agenda, while the rest of the aristocracy is constantly pushing against it. So, in other words, the only person making any real decisions for the entire kingdom across about 70 years of its existence was the High Queen herself. She was truly the sole dictator of the monarchy. That all changed when the Dry Reach incident happened, but I want to talk about that later, because we're still got the Navarre Confederacy to talk about. Now, the Navarre Confederacy obviously consists of several states, right? You've got the state of Al-Jalima, you've got the state of Tufa, you've got the state of Iraq, you've got the state of Al-Arkas, and more recently, because this is a recent addition to the Confederacy, you have the state of Zaikal. Now, each of these states is consistent of about a landmass the size of, I'd say, about Texas plus a couple other states. A pretty decent chunk, right? And each of these states is represented by a person who specifically speaks for the governor of that state in the council, which convenes at Yarak. But this is a true confederacy. In other words, the only times they actually act as one unit is when they're dealing with other nations, right? Otherwise, each state completely runs their own affairs. They also have a very unique form of politics, which I'm particularly proud of, and several of my players actually rather like. It's like this. It's a total democracy that is a total dictatorship at the same time. Put it to you like this. Let's look at the town level. Every person in a town has the right to vote on who their mayor is. Okay, so let's say you happen to lobby for mayorship and you're elected mayor. Yay! Now you have total control of the military assets there, of the economic assets there. You can pass whatever laws you want. You can run the town however you want to. You have total control, total dictatorship, right? However, you are, well, first of all, you're ultimately subservient to whoever's above you. Of which there's not that many layers. It's basically town, region, state. It's just like that, right? Or excuse me, that's actually not true. It's town, district, I think, state, and then region is above that. But I digress. And but the funny thing is, again, the people can vote for a new mayor at any time. There's no such thing as a term of state. You could be mayor for 20 years or for 2 days, depending on how exactly you manage to keep your position. In other words, you have to constantly be keeping all the people in that town, or at least enough of them, happy enough to want to keep you as mayor. If you don't, you'll be removed from office just like that, right? Because, again, all the power actually rests in the people. It's a unique system. It also is really, really, really hard to advance. Only the truly dedicated push themselves past mayor into the district or into the state governorship. Anyone who actually becomes a governor of a state has to have the majority vote of their entire state, which is several million people. And that is not easy to do, and it's basically a full-time job. So you only see the truly dedicated or the truly intelligent or the truly charismatic or some combination thereof actually rise to the point where they become governor. Now, so that's pretty much how that organization runs itself. There's also a group of people called the distributors, whose entire job is to coordinate across regions, regardless of political boundaries. In other words, regions that are solely centered around geopolitical and cultural boundaries, right? Excuse me, not geopolitical, geological and cultural boundaries, completely ignoring the politics. So, and there's three distributor sections in the area. There's the upper reaches, there's there's the far reaches, there's the middle section, whose name I can never remember, and then there's the southern edges. And all three of these distributors are responsible for trying to keep their finger on the pulse of what the people want and how they do that, to advise the governors within their regions, and of course to represent that area when it comes to matters of the state, when they actually come to the council chambers that are in Iraq, which is the actual capital of the area. So that's those four nations. As I already mentioned, Stonehold doesn't really have any organization. The Olthoi kind of have their own thing going on. There's the Ancient Queen. Nobody really knows much about her. She exists. She doesn't meet with most people. And there's the broods I mentioned. Each brood, every so many years, a new brood has been made. The most recent brood at this point being, I think, about 60 years old, which is the worker brood. Which Kazrinthka was a member of. Oh no, I'm sorry. Excuse me. It's the Gardener brood. The Gardener brood. Worker was before that. Each brood has a single queen who is the obvious and is basically in charge of that brood. But when I say in charge of, the Olthoi are weird in the fact that they don't really have orders or organization like most other races do. They have this kind of communal, not quite collective thing going on. It's actually really hard to explain. Basically, there's no individual who's actually in charge of the Olthoi, and there's no governing body per se of the Olthoi. It's more like it's everyone trying to coordinate with everyone else, if that makes any sense. That also doesn't apply to all Olthoi. Service in this communing body, which has to do with trade and negotiation and trying to deal with matters of science and study and history and all that fun stuff. That's all volunteer basis. You don't have to do that. You can choose to, and you can choose to leave if you want to. So that's how the Olthoi works. I think that's enough about the general politics. As I already mentioned, the halflings of Eastham don't really have politics, and the Arwick people are centered around. They're basically run like a tight military corps, even though they don't actually do any military action. And that was set up by the Dereth. There's a lot of culture and a lot of regional things and dialects that I'm obviously skipping over, because if I was just to discuss the whole continent in its entirety, I'd be here for the next 3 weeks. That's one of the reasons I always ask, if you want me to discuss a particular subject that interests you, feel free to say, hey, I'd like you to talk about blah, 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 blah. So feel free as ever to put in the comments below. But I'm not quite done yet, because we have one more major incident, two, actually, really, to talk about. And the first is the Dry Reach incident. Now, the Dry Reach incident is when a group of beings called the Tumarok showed up out of absolutely nowhere and conquered a ridiculously huge swath of land in about 3 days. No one could withstand them. There were no survivors from any of the encounters. The only people who survived were the ones who never actually engaged in direct conflict with them. There are very few exceptions to this. They only have the name Tumarok from some of those people and some of the transmissions they got during this period of time. This incident completely shook the entire balance of how the entire world, the continent, worked up until this point in time. Because people just moved in, conquered, and then stopped. Just stopped dead. And there's been no attempts at communication. Several of the races have tried to send messengers in, tried to send letters in via pigeon. Later on, when airships were developed, they tried to send airships in. No luck, no success. No communication whatsoever. Now, I mentioned airships. The airship was developed in direct response to this. This incident galvanized the Alluvia into becoming the military superpower it is known to be to this day. By the way, the Dry Reach incident was about 30 years ago, to give you a timeline. The Alluvian military, what happened was the High Queen basically bowed out of power. I'm saying in the wrong order. Each region of Alluvia had a lord in charge of it. Now, these lords, this was a system that the High Queen had established. Each lord was someone who was chosen who didn't have money, who didn't have political power, who was not from a big family. It was literally just someone who she believed met her criteria for being a good leader. Nothing else. So she took the cunning, the intelligent, the strategists, all those kind of people, and they had to pass several layers of tests and requirements in order to be named a lord. But each lord was effectively the singular ruler of their given region, ultimately only answerable to her. When the Dry Reach incident happened, the lords completely took over the entire country. Completely ousted the High Queen from power. Although, as I already was about to say, she basically bowed out of power gracefully. She didn't even try to oppose this move. And the lords completely just turned over how half of Alluvia works, completely eliminated half of the bureaucracy, completely yoked the aristocracy in service to the state, and kind of galvanized the military, which at this point had basically been nothing. Most of the military of Alluvia up to this point had been militia, in a given town or a state, or effectively hired thugs or guards or bodyguards or whatever, hired soldiers, in other words, who worked for insert wealthy person A. There was no unified military for Alluvia. It had never been needed. So this act galvanized them, and they made this massive military overhaul, and they started turning tons and tons of their resources and effort into making this massive military buildup, building tons and tons of these airships, which had been developed in relation to this thing, which are, well, engines of death and destruction, unheard of, to put it simply. They also forged a very powerful alliance with the Osteth Republic in direct relation to this incident. And it's worth note that they didn't actually try to ally with Navarre or Sho. The lords decided as a strategic move to only ally with the Republic because they figured any attack by Dry Reach would naturally cause all four nations to respond. They agreed with this. They would not try to play petty politics if the Tumarok tried to expand. They would try to push back in unison with everyone else. But if the Tumarok didn't try to respond, they needed one powerful ally to help them balance out the others to make sure that no one tried to then move in and take Alluvia and perceive Alluvia as weak. By the way, Alluvia lost a huge chunk of land in this incident. As I kind of mentioned, they lost probably the lion's share of the land that was lost, although Alluvia, Navarre, and the Sho all lost territory when the Tumarok attacked, so they didn't really prioritize any given nation. Now, with the lords fully in charge on the development of the airship, Alluvia became this military superpower whose economy quickly started spiraling out of control. And as I said, it's only been 30 years, and already their economy is self-destructing. At least it will in a few more decades. And so the lords have kind of understood that, along with most of the people who are actually in charge and know what's going on in Alluvia. And that's why Alluvia declared war on Navarre. Now, if you've been paying attention to the story, you're like, well, that's not how that happened. Well, this is the real reason. This is why I'm giving you the lore bits of the continent. See, after the militaries of Navarre and Sho effectively defected and went off to conquer Stonehold, Alluvia realized this was the perfect time to declare war without having a huge backlash. Because if they just declared war naturally, which was something they were considering doing, they would lose their alliance with the Republic, which I guess I should talk about why that is, but they would lose their alliance with the Republic, and they would unify all three other nations against them. But with this unheard of, unchecked assault on Stonehold, they were like, moral high ground. And so they declared war just on Navarre, which caused the Sho to be like, well, maybe we don't want to support the Navarre, because, then we'd have to be at war with Alluvia, and it gave the Republic enough pause so they didn't immediately denounce them. Now, let me talk about why the Republic would be against war. Other than the obvious reasons, the Republic military is unique. If you don't understand how this works, if you are trained to take out other people, your training is different than if you are trained to take out beasts and animals. Your very fighting style is different. The way you function, the way you take care of yourself, the things you try to aim for, literally, with ranged weapons and melee weapons both. Your entire tactical style is going to be completely different, right? So the Osteth Republic, as I mentioned, lives in the Osteth mountain range, also known as Death Hole, oh my god, please kill me. So they have a very powerful military, which is very regimental, very strict, very well trained. They have tons of arms and materiel. They have very powerful. They're basically the ones who invented Magitech, as far as the younger races. Obviously, the Dereth and the Scions had access to Magitech, but the Osteth are the ones who invented, for the newer races, Magitech. Came up with the Mag Lancers, came up with the airships, all this fun stuff, all to basically combat this constant threat that the Republic is in and under, right? Well, part of the reason for that is their military is there by purpose to defend people, right? That's the entire point of their military. So if their military was drawn into combat with another military, not only would they be at a huge disadvantage in terms of training and tactics, but they would be morally opposed to what they're doing. Make sense? In actual fact, this kind of came up, as I guess you'll hear about today. Depending, I haven't recorded the video yet, but it should go live before this one. So yeah. So yeah, that's why the Osteth Republic would not be in kind. So the war was declared. War was declared in order to try and help fix the Illuvian economy, which was spiraling out of control. And I guess the last thing to really talk about is the fact that the entire continent is kind of teetered on the brink. The Dereth had moved in and basically mediated the whole continent for 2 centuries before, well, 2.5 centuries actually, before they finally said, okay, fine, do whatever you want, we don't care. And the continents were like, yeah, the country's like, yay, we will do our own thing. And it kind of worked out for a while, but one of the impressions I'm trying to get across to the players and the viewers both is that the continent is very quickly spiraling completely out of control. And if something isn't done soon to try and help curb that, things are going to get worse much quicker and very, very quick and very, very fast. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief diatribe on the continent of Dereth. As always, if you have anything else you would like me to lore run about to discuss in the lore of Primus, please let me know in the comments below. Next week we'll be talking about Desolation, but that's the last one I have scheduled. After that, it's kind of a free game, so we'll see what we think. And I hope to see you next time, guys.